Today's video was chosen by the fantastic people who back this channel on Patreon. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. In the world of beat 'em ups, if Konami are remembered for anything specific, it is often for some of the fantastic games they created, taking advantage of popular licenses away from the world of gaming. Titles such as the X-Men arcade game, the Simpsons arcade, and the Turtles games are fondly celebrated as some of the greatest games produced in the genre. Konami was certainly one of the top dogs in the field when it came to brawlers. These games, with their smooth mechanics paired with mainstream licenses, would result in some of the most memorable beat 'em ups of the era. In the early 90s, not all games of this type though needed an outside license to be popular. For example, Sega's Streets of Rage franchise is a prime example of a game being created with a strong level of appeal without the need to lean on an expensive property, thus resulting in far less profit sharing with the success of this game for Sega too. Today we are going to look at a Konami beat 'em up featuring a world and characters created specifically from scratch for the purpose of this video game. Could Konami replicate the success of Streets of Rage? Well, let's find out. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of Violent Storm, Konami's answer to Streets of Rage 2. Yeah! We find ourselves in 1993. Only a few months have passed since the release of Streets of Rage 2 in December of 1992, a game that holds the accolade of being the most popular console-based beat 'em up of all time. The game would receive perfect or close to perfect review scores across the board, with journalists and gamers alike raving about the quality of this game. Many people thought that the game did not just replicate an arcade beat 'em up style experience, but actually topped it. The title, that features a memorable soundtrack by Yuzo Koshiro, is in fact considered by many to be one of the best games ever made, full stop, let alone just for best beat 'em up. The game just offers so many different levels of appeal. Great music, tight controls, large bold sprites, bright memorable environments, unforgettable characters, all mixed together in a perfect concoction to deliver an optimum gameplay experience without the need to lean on an outside established license. Konami, for the last few years on the other hand, had been heavily leaning on famous IPs to help market the great games they had been creating in the field, which, paired with the quality experiences that the Japanese company had programmed, these titles too are now some of the most memorable games in the genre. Considering there were so many games made featuring this style of gameplay, it just seemed like a sensible way to make their games stand out from the pack. But after witnessing Sega's success with Streets of Rage 2, it seems that Konami would try their luck with creating beat 'em up licenses from scratch. Now, to be fair to the company, this would not be Konami's first crack of a whip in this regard. On this channel before, we have already spoken about various Japanese developers scrambling to create profitable beat 'em ups after the success of Double Dragon 2 The Revenge, with arguably the strongest early results being created in 1989 by Capcom with Final Fight in the arcades and Sega with Golden Axe on the Sega Mega Drive, two games that would further innovate the genre in their own ways. Konami, on the other hand, that year would release Crime Fighters, a game I'm keen to cover on here in depth in the future, which is perhaps the earliest example of a 4-player beat 'em up. This one seems to draw further on the art style of Double Dragon and Renegade, more than many of its contemporaries, which is illustrated by the game's environments and rather small sprites. 2 years later, in 1991, Konami would release a sequel to Crime Fighters known as Vendetta, which pretty much built on the gameplay and aesthetics found within the first Crime Fighters game. By 1993, amongst the many arcade games Konami released, they would of course release Violent Storm, a game that's release appears to be partly inspired by the success of Streets of Rage 2. The two games featured a lot of similarities which we shall cover today. Violent Storm, a game some consider the third game in the Crime Fighters trilogy, was one of 6 brand new arcade games created to run on Konami's newest arcade board. This hardware is commonly known as the Mystic Warriors based hardware. Mystic Warriors was a shoot 'em up and the first game created to run on the board. The game was developed by the same team that made Sunset Riders, so would deliver a similar gameplay experience too. The game we are of course interested in right now though, Violent Storm, is a beat 'em up featuring a selection of 3 playable characters. who you can take control of as you rage through a series of streets in a dystopian future, taking out wave after wave of enemies and defeating big bosses at the end of each level. Now we can safely say that these conventions are not exclusive to Violent Storm or Streets of Rage, as these features are the basis for the likes of Double Dragon, Renegade, Final Fight, Crime Fighters and many more titles from the genre. The reason why I would consider this game a direct response to Streets of Rage 2 would mainly be down to the timing. This game came out 9 months after Streets of Rage 2, and prior to its release, Konami had been mainly focusing on their licensed beat-em-up games instead. The story of Violent Storm takes place in the futuristic setting of the 1990s. Humanity has been through a period of turmoil, but thankfully World War III has now finished. This leaves survivors of this conflict left to pick up the pieces and rebuild civilization. However, vicious gangs and warlords have taken advantage of the chaos, who regularly prey on defenceless citizens. Speaking of conventions, the game offers a short but sweet opening cutscene featuring the 3 playable protagonists witnessing a girl getting kidnapped by a biker. This girl is a friend of theirs named Sheena, who was apparently taken away to a gang leader known as Lord Geld, thus meaning the title features the same damsel in distress narrative as Double Dragon and Final Fight. Like in Streets of Rage, the playable characters are all vigilantes who seek to protect the fearful and helpless. Out of this lineup of fighters we have Wade, who is basically this game's answer to Axel. He is a balanced combatant who specialises in the uppercut. We then have Boris, who is the powerhouse of the group, who can perform the most powerful moves. He also has a selection of devastating throws in his arsenal, making him the game's equivalent to Max. Finally, we have the quick character of the 3, so basically the game's answer to Skate. Kyle can perform rapid kick combinations and makes up for in speed what he lacks in power. As you can see from this gameplay, Violent Storm cabinets allow up to 3 players to experience this game at once, and players must guide their sprites through 7 different varied stages, defeating enemies along the way. As expected, the controls are basic and simple. Cabinets feature an attack and jump button, which used in unison with the directional joystick can be used to perform dashes, throws and flying kicks. The game features other standard mechanics of the era too, such as the ability to use varied weapons, along with opportunities to pick up items to restore health and receive bonus points. Standard stuff really. In terms of a stage-to-stage playthrough, the game starts out with the boys chasing the biker who has kidnapped the girl, even smashing their car through a makeshift shitty wall in the progress, ensuring no one will be safe from Mongolians now. The game is fast-paced and features huge sprites that take up large chunks of the screen, meaning that the action is even closer up on the screen than normal, and players fight through these war-torn streets taking on various Mad Max inspired foes. Action quickly shifts into a derelict train station with a large foe at points looming in the background, giving players an idea of what's to come. He soon smashes through the wall Incredible Hulk style, leading players to take on this masked mace-wielding fatty Boom Boom, who is not much hassle being the first boss. The next stage sees players fighting aboard a moving train, another exhausting trope of the beat-em-up genre, with the background effects being applied to help create the illusion of movement. As expected, players continue to take out punks and ruffians before advancing to inside the carriages of this populated freight train. There is all sorts going on here, including farm animals in transit. When players reach the end of the train, players find a biker, along with a tied-up damsel in distress. They are accompanied by an ugly train conductor who is angry with the player for not having a ticket. This boss has a scissor-like weapon, and design-wise is strikingly similar to the villain in Clock Tower. Large rotund enemy sprites known as lollipops also join the fray in this encounter. Past this point, players progress downtown, which presents a beautiful nighttime city backdrop, which we love to see in these style games. One thing I appreciate about this game is how detailed many of the backgrounds are, and this stage shows many barefoot folks standing around barrel fires, which is a great further illustration of the state of the world here. You'd think it was 2020. Eventually players enter a bar, which involves smashing through tables, another beat 'em up standard we have seen time and time again. The stage does feature a really cool part though, where players take on waves of enemies whilst a belly dancer dances on stage in the background. As mentioned, the backgrounds are really alive in this one. Players then brawl through a kitchen to the shock of the kitchen staff, before working their way into a storeroom and a further confrontation with the biker and the girl. He drops the players through a trapdoor into a caged wrestling ring where the next boss encounter commences. A large crowd watches on as you take on Drigger, a huge wild man and a rather imposing opponent. Next up, players move on to an industrial area, because as you know we tend to always get industrial areas in beat 'em ups. We can't afford to miss rolling barrels as obstacles after all. This factory setting features much of what we are used to, including machinery that can crush the player amongst the usual standard chaos. Players make their way through a smelting hot section until they eventually face off with Doyle. Doyle is a boss who is equipped with a jetpack and large mechanical arms that he can wield as powerful weapons against a player. It's all a bit alien. Action next takes place in a park, with the worn-torn city looming in the background. There are even trees snapped in half here to help continue to illustrate the carnage. Players soon progress into a tropical garden, which is a luscious change of pace to what we have become accustomed to in this affair. We soon arrive outdoors once more, with plenty of crumbling statues to smash. At the very end of the stage though, one of these sculptures comes to life, leaving players to take on the narcissistic Mr. Julius, who has the hilariously innovative fighting technique of combining muscle poses into formidable attacks. Defeating him turns this godlike being back into stone before he shatters into a million pieces. The next stage commences with fighting taking place at the edge of a port, with boats full of people witnessing all the chaos unfold. As usual, the dystopianness is emphasised with plenty of wreckages in the background. Action soon moves to a big red bridge, a setting we have often laughed at on this channel as it appears in so many different beat 'em ups. This is where the next boss fight takes place against Sledge, whose form factor seems to be based on a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle, which could explain the red bridge in the background too. Konami seem to have been self-aware here. We are trying to provide a familiar setting for a boss fight against a character who pays homage to Konami's most popular beat 'em up. Very nice work here in my opinion, and a very cool reference. Finally, players reach the final stage, a museum that has been converted into the villain Stronghold. The game has become Ghostbusters 2 now. Action starts out on the exterior before quickly shifting to the interior. A nice touch once inside are paintings on the wall of all the game's previous bosses. We soon brawl past some arcades, then eventually past a cell housing various women, cheering the player on, as we get forever closer to the end of the game. After moving upstairs, players finally take on Red Freddy, the enemy biker who stole the girl at the beginning of the game. Freddy is a quick opponent who relies on speedy attacks to try and gain an advantage over the player. After defeating Freddy, players discover Lord Geld sitting in his throne with Sheena restrained on the floor next to him. He quickly transforms Dragon Ball Z style before the final fight commences. This large purple foe can literally fling players away from him, projecting energy from his entire body. But after a long encounter, the game finally ends. The day is saved, the villain is dead, and Sheena is finally rescued. As the credits roll, the heroes literally ride off into the sunset. The game also features a secret bonus mode, which is playable if you beat the entire game with just one credit. This is known as the Violent Round. This bonus round will start after you manage to kill the last stage boss. The Violent Round goes again through the same 7 stages, but this time you have faced an increased number of enemies, which is a nice way to reward skilled players in my opinion. Now, before we wrap today's video, I felt that I wanted to touch a bit more on the graphics. You will have noticed throughout this video that the game's sprites are absolutely huge, but not necessarily one of the game's strongest points. Sure, we can see more detail, but with sprites that take up this much space, the experience can feel a tad claustrophobic in my opinion. It feels like this game was made at the tail end of a point in time that developers were making sprites bigger and bigger, a bit like when we went through that period where phones were getting smaller and smaller, until they got so small they became impractical. This game illustrates the sprite equivalent of that phenomenon, where sprites reached impractical sizes. I do kind of get why this was the thought track though, as consumers raved about how good the sprites looked in Streets of Rage 2, over the first game in Golden Axe, but Konami seemed to have gone overboard here. It is also worth touching on the ridiculous music this game delivers. Konami clearly took note of the success of the soundtrack of Streets of Rage 2. So, in their game they included the most early 90s sounding game track you could possibly imagine. Much of the music in this game even features singing and lyrics, and even a bit of terrible rap music too. I guess in many ways this game is a lot more silly and absurd than the many beat 'em ups that came before it. And in a lot of ways the game stands out, as it often feels like it is parodying the genre, mocking the tropes at points rather than just rehashing them. With this in mind, I will say I was disappointed not to see the beat 'em up lift section mocked at any point. As to be fair, this was the first beat 'em up I've ever played, I think, which did not include an obligatory lift section, as it is generally a standard for the genre. Maybe they thought they were being funny by not including it, who knows. Violent Storm overall is a game that appears to take influence from Konami's games of the past and the entire beat 'em up genre in general, but thankfully the game tends to never take itself too seriously, resulting in a whimsical affair which, aside from its oversized sprites, generally delivers on most other levels. So rather than looking at this game as the answer to Streets of Rage 2, I guess it is a comical answer to the beat 'em up genre overall. Despite its release date, in many ways it's a crying shame that this game never ever saw a home console release, as I would bet, due to the system's limitations, one of the first changes they would have made would probably have been shrinking down the oversized sprites, which may have even resulted in it becoming one of the best home beat 'em ups of all time. But I guess there is no point in pondering over what ifs. The game known as Violent Storm offers exactly what it says on the cabinet. A violent storm of fun encapsulating many tropes of the beat 'em up genre that everyone should make the effort to try out. This title is one of the many beat 'em ups from Konami and the beat 'em up genre in general we have looked at in depth on here in the past. So if you are new here and you are yet to check out my content library, I have made plenty of videos for you to go back and enjoy. Make sure you like, subscribe, ring that notification bell and leave a comment letting me know which games you would like to see me cover in the future. Today's video topic was chosen by the wonderful people who back this channel on Patreon, who receive reward incentives such as getting to see these videos before everyone else, access to my Discord, production credits and much more. You can begin to unlock these rewards for yourself and in turn help this channel out too for as little as just $1 a month. Huge thank yous and shout outs go out to Sebastian Velez, Carl Johnson, A Murder of Crows, Hero Paula Lopez, Joseph Rasmick, Doug Perkins, Lou Johnson, DXL Gotham, Rowan Dinched, Evan Border, Philip Manth, Canva Rambo 82, Azra Orakai, Keith Ferguson, Dropkin Varela, Prince Knight, Michael Cullix, Ago, Jordan Durant, TOG Driver, Angel Light 85, Alethea Swanson, Timothy W. Haskins II, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, Carlos Domingos, Glennie Glenn, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of the Ted, Sponge Matt B, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor, Aaron McNamara, Instant Gratification Monkey, Man Shovel, James Bishop, JB, Post TXL, Michael Hall, Wesley Sang He, Ron Studd, Isabel End, Langston Miller, Noob, Brian Barry, Stephen Lewis, Sarah Powell, Flaming Renee, Sarai H. Al Sarai, Marvin Araliga, Chris Cool, Adrian Hannington, Bernard NG, Richard Stu Stewart, James McDonald, Crazy Yarl, Dan Van Dammit, Adam Castin, Gregory Smoradiewicz, Lewis Viant, John Bates, David Bauer, Chris Fisk, Paul Elliott, Mean Machine Dean, Mike Bruno, Rick67, Antonio Rodriguez, Hans Christian, Craig Jenkins, Tom Elliott, Retroversion.com, Casey Wright, Synth Spaces, Zai and Andrew Bezansky. Thank you all very much for continuing to support this channel. I love you all very much and you help me out a lot and I enjoy entertaining you as a result. Thank you so much.